Welcome back everyone on our study in Acts. Today we witness Paul embark on his fourth and final missionary journey with the destination of Rome, one of Paul's longtime standing dreams. Although it was a dream of his to get there, it would be anything but dreamy to get there. As we'll see, Paul would enter into yet another and perhaps one of his most perilous misadventures en route to Rome, all because of human error. But as we'll see that despite this, Paul and his fellow travelers would be saved because of a promise made by God to Paul, which would turn out to be the sole vehicle of salvation for an otherwise doomed expedition, illustrating the unstoppable will and power of God. With that said, let's begin. Today our journey begins in Caesarea. Now, by way of review, Paul's been in house arrest in Caesarea for the charge of sedition in Jerusalem. Caesarea was the capital of Roman-occupied Judea, where regional government was administered by the Romans, and which was now serving as a safe haven for Paul from the Jews who were seeking his death throughout Judea. So it was here that Paul's case or charge of sedition would be heard by the Roman authorities, since he was a Roman citizen, which meant that in this case he was going to be heard by Governor Felix, and this would turn out to be a mixed blessing for Paul. And this is because history records Governor Felix as being somewhat of an ineffective governor subject to bribery, but even with that, found no fault in Paul and determined to have him released. But, as with the character flaws inherent in Governor Felix's tendencies, he procrastinated on Paul's release for 2 years, after which Paul faced another governor, Governor Festus, who in turn also found him not guilty. So 2 successive governors found Paul innocent of the charges of sedition, but for reasons unstated, Paul decided to appeal to Caesar, a right reserved for Roman citizens to have their cases heard by the supreme authority, which in this case meant Nero. So again, although not explicitly stated, Paul's appeal was almost certainly due to his not wanting to be released into Jewish authorities by the Roman governors, because this would mean Paul would be released into a death trap. There were many Jewish leaders that were out to kill Paul. And another reason for the appeal to Caesar was that Paul simply wanted to go to Rome, and if he appealed to Caesar, he could get a Roman escort there. And with that said, let's turn to our text. Today we'll be in Acts chapter 27. We'll begin at verse 1. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium, about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. So now Paul has been transferred to a Roman centurion, and now he's with some other fellow prisoners, about to board probably a mid-sized merchant ship to sail the Mediterranean. Now, a few notes on sailing in the Mediterranean and Aegean Sea. Sailing the Mediterranean could be a precarious endeavor. It was subject to violent storms and unpredictable weather, making it dangerous for sailors on the sea. It was frequently responsible for causing loss of goods and shipwrecks. So sailors were acutely aware of the dangers of the Mediterranean and had to be very careful about when they sailed. What's more is that it was also subject to restrictive winds, making travel difficult, if not impossible. So, for example, between the months of mid-May to mid-September, the Mediterranean would be experiencing what's called the Etesian winds, which is Greek for periodic winds. And these were dry winds coming from the northwest, blowing to the southeast. And this made travel either difficult or easy, depending on which direction you were going. So if you were sailing westward, you were punished by winds that would blow you back and make sailing much slower to get to your destination. Conversely, if you were sailing eastward, you had the winds blowing for you. Accordingly, this meant that ships and sailors had to be strategic about the routes they chose and the time of the years that they sailed. For example, and as we'll see in a moment, sailors would travel around islands with mountainous regions blocking the westward winds, allowing for them to travel westward a little bit more easily. But it wasn't only routes that you had to be careful about choosing and the time of the year. You also had to be careful about where you harbored your boat, because if you're at the wrong harbor, you could have winds cast your ship aground or cause your ship to run into rocks. And that's not the worst of it. As fall approached, so after mid-September, the Mediterranean was often subject to increasingly violent storms, which made travel even more difficult and more dangerous, so you'd have reduced traffic on the Mediterranean. When winter finally arrived, travel ceased entirely. So mid-May to mid-September, travel was difficult. Mid-September to mid-November, travel was dangerous. And then mid-November to mid-February was a total blackout period. There was no travel. Just the Mediterranean Sea was just too dangerous to sail. That said, we still haven't even mentioned the worst of it yet, which of course Paul would encounter. After all, it wouldn't be a Paul story if there wasn't some peril in it. That said, Let's read verses 3 to 4. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. From there we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. So right now, Paul is being joined by Luke and Aristarchus, fellow believers, and it's noteworthy to mention here that Julius was a centurion who belonged to the Augustan regiment, which was a special corps of men and officers that acted as a liaison between the emperor and the provinces. So he was an important person. And he didn't really have to go out his way to show kindness to Paul, but he did. Where did that kindness come from? Perhaps the favor of God? Well, let's move on. Note that the text mentions that their route was around the lee of Cyprus. This is what we discussed about sailors hugging islands to protect themselves from the northwestern winds. So here they were sailing on the eastern side of Cyprus because their mountainous range of Cyprus would help shield them from the winds, allowing for better travel. Verse 5. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us up on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving at Cnidus. When the winds did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmon. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to the place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea. So Paul arrives at a place called Myra, at which place they switch ships. So recall, Paul's on a small merchant vessel, but now he's being switched into a much larger vessel probably carrying grains from Egypt, because Rome, like any other empire, would import the majority of its grains from Egypt. This new ship would be considerably larger than the prior ship, with a capacity of probably around 600 people. But for our story, it only had 276 people on board, but it was probably loaded with lots of cargo, so it was a heavy ship. Now note the mention of slow headway for many days. Paul and his fellow travelers were now entering into the western winds. The winds were pushing back, they were pushing back hard and continuously, and this forced them to reroute down to Cyprus at the port of Fair Havens. Let's read verse 9. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Day of Atonement is around mid-September usually. This means that Paul's sailing right around the time when the Mediterranean becomes dangerous. So the western winds have considerably slowed Paul's journey to Rome, and right now they're probably only about 50% of their way to Rome. They have 1,000 miles-ish remaining out of a 2,000-mile journey. So dangerous season is just about to begin. With this, we read verse 9. So Paul warned them, "Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also." But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. So the ship was currently at Fair Havens, and it was determined, and this is probably correct, that the harbor itself wasn't the safest or best harbor to be in. So remember, some ships can be destroyed if they're at the wrong harbors at the wrong time because maybe the winds could blow them against rocks or run them aground or whatever. And the ship owner thought wisely that the safer harbor would be at Phoenix. So Paul decides to chime in and say, "Well, I know you're an experienced traveler, but I too am an experienced sailor throughout the Mediterranean, and now is not a good time to be out sailing, even though this is not the best harbor to be in. So my message is, stay put, do not sail to another harbor." But unfortunately for Paul and his fellow sailors, he was overruled. The others decided that the port of Fair Havens was not safe enough compared to Phoenix, and that they were willing to risk encountering a storm to sail around the island of Crete. Now, this wasn't necessarily an irrational decision. After all, these were experienced sailors too, and the port of Phoenix was only about 40 miles away from their current port of Fair Havens. So in a word, the sailors were in a race against time. They were aware that the violent winter storms were soon coming, and they felt that those storms would cause more risk or harm to them if they stayed in port than if they were to travel to Phoenix. So sail on they did, and this would turn out to be a fatal mistake. Paul would now be sailing on a Titanic in the making. So what happened next? Verse 13. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity. So they weighed anchor and they sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. So as they sailed, they encountered light winds, which turned into more violent winds and a storm. And then finally they encountered what some Bibles call the Euroclydon. And this is a hurricane-like storm that occurs in the fall and the winter, and it contains some of the most powerful winds that the Mediterranean sees. So what was bad went from bad to worst. Navigation was now impossible. Let's read verse 16. As we passed to the lee of the small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure, so the men hoisted it abroad. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together, because they were afraid that they would be run aground on the sandbars of Cyprus. They lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. So Paul was now stuck in a storm, a major storm that went on for days. This meant that a ship that could no longer be navigated was being thrown around like crazy, which in turn meant that its passengers were probably not sleeping very well, certainly probably weren't eating very well, and they were constantly subject to loss of body balance. So it was a constant taxing of the body and of the mind. What's more, because of the storm, the stars at night and the land around them in the Mediterranean were no longer visible, which means that the sailors had no idea which direction they were going. They couldn't row, they couldn't steer. They were sailing blind and were at the complete mercy of the sea. And after many days of this, despair finally began to set in, and people were just simply waiting to die. All hope was lost. Everyone had given up. Everyone except for one. And who was that one? Verse 21. When many had lost their appetites, Paul then stood up among them and said, Men, you should have followed my advice and not have set sail from Crete, and thereby spared yourselves this damage and loss. And yet, now I urge you to keep your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. Verse 23. For this very night, an angel of the God, to whom I belong, whom I also serve, came to me, saying, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has graciously granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe that God it will turn out exactly as I have been told, but we must run aground on a certain island. So just when all hope seemed lost, Paul stood up and said, See, I told you so. There was a human side to Paul. But then he proceeds to encourage his fellow sailors, the pagan sailors, about God's promise to him. You will all be saved, but here's what you need to do. So what's happening here is that Paul was on a doomed expedition. Indeed, all was lost. The only thing that saved that ship, the only thing that saved Paul was a promise that God made to Paul. So what seemed to be a hopeless situation, a hopeless scenario, there was a way out. But there was some things that the sailors were going to have to do. God was going to use human agency to deliver them. In other words, both the sailors and Paul had a role to play in this. And what was that? Well, first, they had to run the ship aground, meaning they had to destroy the ship by landing it onto a beach. What else? Verse 27. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. Skipping to verse 29. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let down the lifeboat into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. So what was the second thing that the sailors had to do? The sailors had to stay in the boat because God promised in his vision to Paul that all sailors would be delivered. But as we just read, certain men were trying to escape the main ship via the lifeboat, to which Paul says, you have to cut that lifeboat away. Cut it away. And this was probably a hard thing for certain men to hear because that was their only way, perhaps their only way of salvation from their perspective. Paul said, no, cut the boat. And in doing so, this would put the sailors completely in the hands of God. They had no other remedy, no other means of escape except through Paul's God. And fortunately for Paul, and fortunately for themselves, this time they listened to Paul. And this may be because they realized that Paul was right in the beginning in telling them not to sail, which they disregarded, and now also that there were no other options available. They were hopelessly lost at sea. Skipping to verse 39. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow was struck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. So after a 14-day harrowing experience, the sailors finally make it to land. They make it to their shipwrecked on the island of Malta, and as God promised, not one person died. However, it came at the expense of a catastrophic economic loss and the near loss of every person on board, all because of a bad human choice. But despite this bad human choice, and despite what seems to be insurmountable weather, a hopeless situation, the power of God's word and his promise to Paul trumped everything. God ordained for Paul to be present in Rome in front of Caesar, and nothing was going to stop that. So despite an impossible scenario, which would have been an impossible scenario if God had intervened, Paul was effectively invincible, meaning that Paul was not going to leave the earth one day or even 1 second earlier than God had ordained. Now, we're not going to cover it today, but it is worth mentioning that Paul's shipwrecking on the island of Malta actually turned out to have an unexpected blessing, who would later be used to heal people on the island, and he would be shown unusual favorness or kindness by the inhabitants of the land. And what this reveals is that God was working behind the scenes to enable Paul to get to Rome. He was enabling Paul by providing provisions, and he was also using Paul to execute a ministry there in Malta. So God is in the business of redeeming time, even in the midst of our human error. Put in other words, God still does good things despite and through our mistakes. So turning to us, there are some important lessons we can extract from all this. First, we saw the sailors seek out a safer haven than what Fair Havens offered. Although not ideal, Fair Havens was better and safer than traveling to the safer Phoenix or the better Phoenix. The sailors sought better at the expense of good, which reminds me of a saying that my late plastic surgeon father used to say regarding patients, or particularly women that were seeking beauty or greater beauty at the expense of their current beauty. He'd said, the enemy of good is better, meaning women out there who wanted to be prettier ended up being less pretty by trying to become more pretty through surgery. They'd have surgery and they would end up looking weird. So in a word, learn to rest in God's good and don't seek the world's better. Sometimes God calls us to be still or to wait in a stormy place in which we wait out an even worse storm. We don't know the future or God's will at times, so don't be quick to escape an uncomfortable, quote, good haven for a better haven. There may be something else that God is protecting you from that's even worse than your current situation. Second, God has ordained respective callings and tasks for all people to fulfill. Accordingly, expect that God will supply all needs and all provision to enable you to fulfill your calling or his calling for you. As dire as all seemed with Paul and the sailors, and despite being on a certain, and it was a certain, doomed expedition, there never was a chance that Paul was going to be lost at sea. He was called to Rome, and to Rome he was going. And since God doesn't change, we can expect that same level of safety and provision that to enable us to fulfill our respective callings that God has for our lives. In other words, we all have our journeys to Rome, and we are going to go to Rome if we remain in the will of God, and if we don't try to craft inferior or dangerous exits out of a current situation that might seem uncomfortable. Lastly, and only briefly touched on today, God does use detours in our lives. Even if we mess things up and we cause our own shipwrecks, God can still operate through those and do great things. So don't look on your past failures as a total loss. Realize that God can redeem the time and God can still use you mightily. In fact, I urge all my listeners here today, don't even think about your past failures. Forget about them. They are a total waste of time. As Paul says, keep pressing on the race, not looking behind. The runners that look behind as they're running forward are the ones that are going to lose. Don't do that. Trust God, and he can redeem your time. And with that said, let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank you for the time here today. I thank you for my listeners. I thank you for recording the events in Acts, especially those events in Paul's life from which we can learn. I Pray, Lord, that you'll cause everyone here listening today to learn to trust into you and to not seek escape routes that seem better than the current good that you have for us, because those always are. Paradoxically, they are worse. Help us to lean into you and to trust you through those bad situations and to learn to wait on you in the midst of a storm. And then help us to not look back to our past failures and use those as excuses, or let those be stones around our neck that hold us back from completing our own respective races. Every single person who's listening today has a calling, and a calling that will be fulfilled in your will. Help us trust in that and not be succumbed to temptations or enticements from the world that will take us away from that, or stress or anxiety that will cause us to doubt. With that said, ladies and gentlemen, I want to say thank you for your time today, and I'll see you next time. God bless you all.